The applause thundered across Fort Riverside as Colonel Marcus Brennan stepped toward the refreshment tent, his chest heavy with ribbons and his swagger unmistakable. Sarah Mitchell was quietly arranging injury prevention pamphlets when she felt his hand grab her arm with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no. She turned to face him, her expression calm, almost bored. He squeezed harder, expecting submission. Instead, she moved with precision that defied explanation, and suddenly the decorated colonel was on his knees, his hand bent at an angle that made seasoned soldiers wince. The crack that echoed across the ceremony grounds wasn't applause anymore. It was bone meeting the limits of human anatomy, and 190 soldiers watched in stunned silence as their distinguished guest learned that some people's quiet demeanor hides capabilities that can reshape your entire understanding of power in a single devastating moment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The spring air at Fort Riverside carried the crisp scent of fresh-cut grass, and the underlying tang of military equipment oil that seemed to permeate every corner of the sprawling training facility. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the main parade ground where bleachers had been arranged in perfect military precision, each row aligned with geometric perfection that spoke to the exacting standards of the institution. The annual Combat Readiness Ceremony was Fort Riverside's premier event, drawing distinguished guests, military families and media representatives from across the region. It was the kind of formal gathering where reputations were built, careers were advanced, and the military's finest traditions were displayed with ceremonial grandeur. The ceremony grounds buzzed with controlled energy, as soldiers from multiple units prepared for the formal presentations. The sound of polished boots on concrete mixed with the rustle of dress uniforms, and the occasional bark of commands as formation leaders ensured every detail met inspection standards. Above it all hung an atmosphere of professional pride, the kind that came from months of preparation culminating in a single afternoon of recognition and celebration. The VIP seating area gleamed with brass buttons and service ribbons, while photographers positioned themselves to capture moments that would grace official publications and unit newsletters for months to come. Sarah Mitchell moved through this world of military precision like a gentle current in a powerful river, present but unobtrusive, professional but unremarkable. Her civilian clothes marked her as an outsider in this sea of uniforms, yet her purposeful movements suggested someone comfortable navigating institutional environments. She wore simple black slacks and a navy blazer that spoke of professional competence without drawing attention, her brown hair pulled back in a practical style that kept it away from her face while she worked. Her hands, though soft in appearance, bore the subtle calluses of someone who worked with resistance and human anatomy, the kind of marks that came from years of helping bodies recover from trauma and injury. As the afternoon progressed, she had positioned herself near the refreshment area where she could observe the ceremony while remaining available for the injury prevention consultations that had brought her to Fort Riverside. Her table displayed brochures on proper lifting techniques, ergonomic workplace setup, and early intervention strategies for repetitive stress injuries. It was unglamorous work, the kind of behind-the-scenes support that kept military units functioning at peak efficiency, but rarely garnered recognition or attention. She had learned to appreciate the quiet satisfaction of preventing problems rather than solving crises, of teaching techniques that would save careers and extend service member effectiveness long after they forgot her name. Colonel Marcus Brennan commanded attention the moment he stepped onto the ceremony grounds, his presence announcing itself through the subtle but unmistakable deference of everyone around him. His dress blues were immaculate, each ribbon and decoration positioned with mathematical precision that spoke to decades of military service and careful attention to protocol. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened, salutes rendered, and conversations paused until he was ready to participate. His silver hair was regulation perfect, his posture spoke of command authority, and his handshake carried the firm grip of someone who had spent a career making decisions that affected thousands of lives. At 53, Brennan had built his reputation on demanding excellence and accepting no excuses for substandard performance. His commands had consistently ranked among the highest performing units in their respective categories, and his leadership style had become the subject of case studies at military leadership schools. He expected subordinates to anticipate his needs, civilians to accommodate his schedule, and organizations to adjust their procedures to match his preferences. It was an approach that had served him well throughout a distinguished career, earning him rapid promotions and increasingly prestigious assignments. Yet beneath his professional success lay a personality that had grown comfortable with the privileges of rank, perhaps too comfortable with the assumption that his authority extended beyond military matters into any situation where he chose to assert himself. He had developed the habit of treating civilian contractors, support staff, and administrative personnel as extensions of his military command structure, expecting the same immediate compliance he received from uniformed personnel. It was a tendency that had been overlooked or accommodated by those around him, partly out of respect for his.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Service record, and partly because few were willing to challenge a full colonel's behavior in professional settings. The ceremony had proceeded flawlessly through its opening phases, with unit recognitions, individual awards and keynote addresses delivered with the polished precision that military events demanded. Brennan had been the featured speaker, delivering remarks on leadership, dedication, and the evolving challenges facing modern military forces. His presentation had been well received, earning the kind of respectful applause that acknowledged both his message and his status within the military hierarchy. As the formal portion of the event transitioned into the reception phase, he found himself surrounded by junior officers and enlisted personnel, seeking to make favorable impressions, and perhaps advance their own careers through brief interactions with such a distinguished guest. The refreshment area became a natural gathering point, as ceremony attendees moved from the formal seating arrangements to more relaxed socializing opportunities. Tables laden with coffee, pastries, and light refreshments created small conversation clusters where military personnel could network, families could meet unit leadership, and civilian contractors could make connections that might lead to future opportunities. It was during this transition period that the carefully maintained atmosphere of professional decorum began to show its first signs of strain. Sarah had been explaining proper stretching techniques to a small group of soldiers when she noticed Colonel Brennan approaching her table with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to having his path cleared automatically. His expression carried the mixture of mild interest and casual authority that suggested he viewed her presence as something requiring his personal attention and approval. She finished her explanation about hip flexor stretches, and turned to acknowledge his approach with the same professional courtesy she extended to everyone who stopped by her information table. "Colonel," she said simply, offering the respectful acknowledgement appropriate for his rank, while maintaining the neutral tone she used with all military personnel. Her voice carried no particular deference beyond basic politeness, no suggestion that his presence was either particularly welcome or unwelcome. She treated him as she would any other ceremony attendee seeking information about injury prevention or physical therapy services. Brennan paused at her table, his eyes scanning the displayed materials with the kind of cursory interest that suggested he was evaluating their relevance to his broader responsibilities, rather than seeking specific information for personal use. His presence immediately drew the attention of nearby personnel, creating a small bubble of heightened awareness as soldiers and junior officers noticed their senior leader engaging with a civilian contractor. The dynamic subtly shifted the energy around the refreshment area, as conversations became more subdued and body language became more formal in response to his proximity. "Physical therapy," he said, his tone carrying the analytical assessment of someone categorizing information for future reference. "Interesting that they bring civilian specialists to a combat readiness ceremony." His comment wasn't quite a question, but it carried an implied request for justification that suggested he viewed her presence as requiring explanation or approval. Sarah recognized the tone immediately, having encountered similar attitudes from military personnel, who viewed civilian contractors as necessary but subordinate elements within their operational environment. She had learned to navigate these interactions with professional composure, providing the information requested without becoming defensive about her role or credentials. "Injury prevention is a readiness issue," she replied matter-of-factly. "Keeping personnel healthy and functional supports mission effectiveness." Her response was correct, concise, and entirely appropriate for the situation. It acknowledged his implied question while establishing her professional legitimacy within the military context. She neither apologized for her presence nor elaborated beyond what was necessary to address his apparent interest. Her tone remained neutral, professional, and respectful without crossing into the kind of deferential behavior that some civilian contractors adopted when interacting with senior military leadership. Brennan studied her for a moment, his expression reflecting the mental processes of someone accustomed to rapid assessments of personnel and situations. He seemed to be categorizing her according to his established frameworks for understanding how different types of people fit within his spheres of influence and authority. The fact that she didn't immediately elaborate or seek to impress him with additional credentials appeared to register as either refreshing confidence or subtle disrespect, depending on his momentary interpretation of her behavior. "Your credentials," he said, the words carrying the expectation of immediate compliance that came from decades of having his requests treated as orders requiring prompt execution. His tone suggested this was routine verification rather than hostile interrogation, but the underlying assumption was clear. He had the right to demand any information he deemed relevant, and she had the obligation to provide it without question or delay. Sarah reached for her credential folder with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to all her professional interactions, neither rushing to accommodate his demand, nor deliberately delaying to assert independence. Her movements reflected someone comfortable with routine verification processes, and confident in her qualifications to withstand any level of scrutiny. She handed him the folder containing her licensure documentation, continuing education certificates, and military contractor clearances with the calm assurance of someone whose credentials were both current and comprehensive. Brennan examined the documents with the thorough attention he applied to all administrative matters requiring his review, his expression reflecting the mental processes of someone accustomed to identifying discrepancies, inconsistencies, or areas requiring additional clarification. Her credentials were impressive: doctoral degree in physical therapy from a prestigious university, specialized certifications in sports medicine and trauma rehabilitation, extensive experience with military and law enforcement populations, and security clearances that indicated previous work with sensitive military projects. As he reviewed her qualifications, something in his demeanor shifted subtly, moving from routine verification toward a more personal evaluation that seemed to extend beyond professional credentials into areas of individual assessment and potential interaction. His examination of her documentation became more prolonged than strictly necessary, and his occasional glances in her direction carried an evaluative quality that suggested he was forming opinions about her as a person rather than simply as a service provider. The moment when routine professional interaction crossed into something more problematic was subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the warning signs of inappropriate behavior. Brennan's questions about her background became more personal. His physical positioning moved closer than professional courtesy required, and his tone shifted from formal assessment to something that carried undertones of personal interest rather than purely professional evaluation. "Impressive background," he said, returning her credentials but allowing his hand to linger longer than necessary during the transfer. "I'd like to discuss how your services might benefit my command structure." The words themselves were professional, but his tone and body language suggested conversations that would extend well beyond official business hours and formal command relationships. Sarah recognized the shift immediately, having encountered similar situations throughout her career in male-dominated professional environments. Her response was measured and professional, designed to redirect the interaction back to appropriate business channels without creating unnecessary confrontation. "My contact information is in the folder," she replied, stepping back slightly to re-establish appropriate physical distance. Your administrative staff can coordinate any official consultations through proper channels. Her response was perfect, courteous, professional, and clear about appropriate boundaries without being confrontational or disrespectful to his rank. She had effectively redirected his personal approach toward official procedures while maintaining the professional courtesy appropriate for their respective positions. It was exactly the kind of skilled interpersonal navigation that had allowed her to build a successful career while avoiding the pitfalls that could derail professional relationships in institutional environments. But Colonel Brennan was not accustomed to having his approaches redirected, regardless of how skillfully or courteously the redirection was accomplished. His position within the military hierarchy had created an environment where his preferences were typically accommodated, and his suggestions were treated as guidance requiring implementation rather than offers subject to polite decline. The fact that she had professionally but firmly established boundaries seemed to register as an unexpected obstacle rather than appropriate professional behavior. Rather than accepting her professional redirection and moving their interaction back to appropriate channels, Brennan chose to interpret her boundary setting as a challenge requiring more direct assertion of his authority and status. His hand moved to her arm, not violently but with the confident expectation that physical contact would communicate his seriousness and her expected compliance more effectively than continued verbal negotiation. "I think you misunderstood," he said, his grip firm enough to prevent her from stepping away further while maintaining the appearance of casual contact that could be dismissed as accidental if questioned later. "I'm suggesting a more immediate conversation about your role here." His tone carried the implication that her professional redirection had been inappropriate, and that he was offering her an opportunity to correct her approach before consequences became necessary. The grab itself wasn't violent, but it was unmistakably controlling, designed to communicate that her attempts to maintain professional distance were unsuccessful, and that he possessed both the authority and the intent to override her preferences regarding their interaction. It was the kind of power demonstration that relied on her anticipated compliance rather than actual force, the assumption being that she would recognize his authority and adjust her behavior accordingly, rather than escalate the situation into something more publicly visible. What happened next unfolded with such speed and precision that most observers initially struggled to understand exactly what they had witnessed. Sarah's response wasn't emotional or angry, it was purely mechanical, executed with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke to training so deeply ingrained that it had become instinctive rather than conscious. Her movement was economical, precise, and devastatingly effective in ways that suggested expertise far beyond anything indicated by her professional credentials or civilian appearance. The technique she employed was a textbook example of leverage mechanics applied to human anatomy, using Brennan's own grip and forward momentum against him while simultaneously targeting the specific joint structures most vulnerable to rotational stress. Her hand placement was exact, her timing was perfect, and her application of force was calibrated to achieve maximum effectiveness with minimum effort. It was the kind of movement that required extensive training to execute properly and demonstrated a level of technical proficiency that went far beyond basic self-defense instruction. The sound that resulted was unmistakable to anyone who had ever heard bone and cartilage reaching the limits of their structural integrity under applied stress. It wasn't the dramatic crack of Hollywood fight scenes, but rather the softer, more disturbing sound of living tissue responding to forces beyond its design parameters. The noise carried clearly across the refreshment area, immediately drawing the attention of everyone within hearing range and creating a moment of absolute silence as brains processed the incongruity between what they had expected to witness and what had actually occurred. Colonel Brennan's response was immediate and involuntary, his body's nervous system overriding conscious control as pain receptors transmitted information that demanded immediate attention and response. His knees buckled not from choice but from neurological imperative, as his body automatically adjusted to protect the injured extremity while simultaneously processing pain levels that exceeded his capacity for conscious management. The proud posture and confident bearing that had defined his presence throughout the ceremony disappeared instantly, replaced by the universal human response to unexpected physical trauma. The silence that followed stretched across the ceremony grounds like a physical presence, as 190 soldiers and dozens of civilian attendees struggled to process what they had just witnessed. The cognitive dissonance was profound. A distinguished military officer, a full colonel with decades of command experience, had been incapacitated by a civilian contractor in business attire who appeared to weigh perhaps 2/3 of his body weight. The visual evidence was undeniable, but the implications challenged every assumption about power, authority, and capability that had structured their understanding of the situation. Sarah stood over the kneeling colonel with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout their entire interaction, her expression reflecting neither satisfaction nor concern but rather the neutral professionalism of someone who had simply responded appropriately to an unwelcome situation. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged, and her overall demeanor suggested that what had just occurred was merely a minor interruption in her afternoon rather than a dramatic confrontation requiring emotional processing or lengthy explanation. The emergency medical technician who arrived first at the scene took one look at Colonel Brennan's hand and immediately called for additional support, his professional assessment indicating injuries that would require specialized orthopedic intervention rather than basic field treatment. The angle of the colonel's wrist defied normal human anatomy, with visible displacement that suggested multiple fractures and possible ligament damage that would require surgical repair. As the EMT began his preliminary examination, Brennan's face had taken on the grayish pallor that medical professionals recognized as the body's response to significant trauma and shock. Sergeant First Class David Chen had been standing near the awards table when the incident occurred, and his 22 years of military service had provided him with enough experience to recognize when situations had moved far beyond normal disciplinary channels into territory that would require formal investigation and detailed documentation. His immediate response was to secure the area and begin the process of witness identification that would be essential for any subsequent inquiry into what had transpired between a senior officer and a civilian contractor. The crowd of ceremony attendees had formed a rough circle around the incident site, their collective behavior reflecting the human tendency to observe dramatic events while simultaneously maintaining enough distance to avoid becoming directly involved in whatever consequences might follow. Conversations had dropped to whispers as people struggled to process the incongruity between what they had witnessed and their existing understanding of appropriate behavior at formal military functions. Captain Lisa Rodriguez approached the scene with the careful steps of someone who understood that her response to this situation would be scrutinized and remembered by everyone present, including several officers senior to her in rank and experience. Her training had prepared her for managing various types of incidents at military events, but the specific circumstances of a decorated colonel being physically incapacitated by a civilian contractor fell outside the standard protocols she had studied during her officer development courses. Private First Class Tyler Johnson stood frozen near the refreshment table, his phone halfway out of his pocket as he wrestled with the competing impulses to document what he had witnessed and avoid the career-ending consequences that could result from recording a senior officer in a compromising position. His brief military experience had taught him that involvement in incidents involving field-grade officers often led to complications that could follow junior enlisted personnel for the remainder of their service, regardless of their actual level of responsibility or culpability. Master Sergeant Robert Hayes moved through the crowd with the purposeful efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations and restoring order when normal procedures had broken down. His assessment of the scene took in not only the immediate medical emergency but also the broader implications of what had occurred in front of multiple witnesses representing different units, military families, and civilian organizations that maintained ongoing relationships with Fort Riverside. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that the base emergency response system had been activated, bringing with it the formal documentation processes that would transform what had been an interpersonal incident into an official matter requiring detailed investigation and administrative review. Hayes understood that every decision made in the next few minutes would be examined by investigators, attorneys, and senior commanders seeking to understand how a routine ceremony had resulted in a senior officer requiring emergency medical treatment. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Williams had been networking with visiting dignitaries when she heard the commotion from the refreshment area, and her approach to the scene reflected the measured pace of someone who understood that senior officers were expected to project calm authority even in chaotic situations. Her initial assessment focused on establishing facts rather than assigning blame, recognizing that her official response would likely influence how the incident was characterized in subsequent reports and investigations. Sarah Mitchell remained exactly where she had been standing when the confrontation ended, her posture and expression unchanged despite the growing crowd of observers and the increasing level of official attention being directed toward the scene. Her stillness contrasted sharply with the activity swirling around her as medical personnel attended to Colonel Brennan while military personnel began the process of securing witness statements and establishing the preliminary facts that would guide subsequent administrative actions. The base public affairs officer arrived with the grim expression of someone who understood that incidents involving senior officers and civilian contractors at public events generated exactly the kind of media attention that military installations preferred to avoid. His immediate priorities included managing information flow to prevent speculation from filling the vacuum left by official silence while ensuring that any public statements accurately reflected established facts rather than preliminary impressions or unsubstantiated rumors. Colonel Brennan's attempts to minimize the severity of his injuries were undermined by his obvious inability to use his right hand and the visible swelling that had already begun to distort the normal contours of his wrist and forearm. His requests for privacy and his insistence that the incident be handled through informal channels conflicted with both medical necessity and military regulations governing incidents that occurred in public settings with multiple witnesses present. The emergency medical team's assessment confirmed what visual observation had already suggested. Colonel Brennan had sustained multiple fractures requiring immediate transport to the base medical facility for comprehensive evaluation and treatment. The EMT's professional recommendation that he be evacuated by ambulance rather than personal vehicle indicated injuries serious enough to require constant monitoring during transport, effectively eliminating any possibility that the incident could be handled discreetly or kept from official attention. As the ambulance doors closed and Colonel Brennan was transported away from the ceremony grounds, the attention of everyone present shifted towards Sarah Mitchell, whose calm demeanor and apparent lack of concern about the consequences of her actions suggested either remarkable composure or a level of confidence that indicated she possessed information about the situation that wasn't immediately apparent to other observers. Sergeant First Class Chen approached Sarah with the professional courtesy appropriate for someone who might be either a victim of inappropriate behavior or a perpetrator of assault against a senior officer, depending
on which interpretation of events proved to be accurate after formal investigation. His experience had taught him that initial impressions often proved incomplete or misleading once all relevant facts were established through proper investigative procedures. "Ma'am," Chen said, his tone carefully neutral as he sought to balance respect for her civilian status with recognition that she had just physically incapacitated a full colonel in front of multiple witnesses. "I'm going to need to ask you some questions about what just happened here." His approach reflected the delicate balance required when dealing with incidents that involved both military personnel and civilian contractors, particularly when the civilian appeared to have emerged from the confrontation in significantly better condition than the uniformed service member. Sarah's response demonstrated the same measured professionalism she had maintained throughout the entire incident, her voice carrying neither defensiveness nor anxiety as she acknowledged Chen's authority to conduct preliminary inquiries into what had transpired. "Of course, Sergeant, I understand you have procedures to follow." Her cooperation was immediate and complete, suggesting someone familiar with institutional investigation processes and comfortable with official scrutiny of her actions. The preliminary questions focused on establishing basic facts, the sequence of events leading up to the physical confrontation, the nature of any verbal exchange that had preceded the incident, and Sarah's assessment of whether Colonel Brennan's actions had constituted inappropriate behavior requiring defensive response. Her answers were precise, factual, and delivered without embellishment or editorial comment about motivations or character assessments.
Captain Rodriguez joined the preliminary interview as the investigating officer, her questions reflecting military legal training that emphasized documentation of facts rather than interpretation of intentions or assignment of blame. The captain's approach demonstrated awareness that incidents involving allegations of inappropriate conduct by senior officers required careful handling to ensure that both victims' rights and accused personnel's due process protections were properly maintained throughout the investigation process. Did Colonel Brennan make any verbal statements that you interpreted as inappropriate or threatening? Rodriguez asked, her notebook ready to record exact quotations rather than paraphrased summaries that might be challenged during subsequent legal proceedings. The question reflected understanding that sexual harassment cases often depended on precise documentation of language used and the context in which potentially problematic statements were made. Sarah's recollection was detailed and exact, her ability to quote verbatim conversations that had occurred under stress suggesting either exceptional memory or prior experience with situations requiring precise recall of verbal exchanges for official purposes. Her responses included not only the content of what had been said but also descriptions of tone, body language, and environmental factors that had influenced her interpretation of Colonel Brennan's intentions and behavior. He said he wanted to discuss how my services might benefit his command structure. Sarah reported accurately, but his tone and physical positioning suggested he was referring to personal rather than professional arrangements. Her assessment was measured and professional, avoiding inflammatory language while clearly communicating her interpretation of behavior that had crossed appropriate boundaries. The investigation expanded to include witness statements from ceremony attendees who had observed various portions of the interaction between Sarah and Colonel Brennan, their accounts providing multiple perspectives on events that had unfolded in full view of dozens of military personnel and civilian guests. The consistency of witness observations supported Sarah's version of events while raising serious questions about Colonel Brennan's conduct and judgment. Private Johnson's statement proved particularly valuable because his position near the refreshment table had provided him with an unobstructed view of the entire interaction from its beginning through its dramatic conclusion. His account included details about Colonel Brennan's approach, his examination of Sarah's credentials, and the visible change in his demeanor as the conversation had progressed from professional inquiry toward personal interest. Master Sergeant Hayes contributed observations about Colonel Brennan's reputation and previous behavior at similar events, his 28 years of military experience providing context for assessing whether the incident represented an isolated lapse in judgment or part of a pattern of inappropriate conduct toward civilian contractors and subordinate personnel. His reluctant admission that similar complaints had been raised informally in the past suggested institutional awareness of problematic behavior that had been inadequately addressed through normal channels. The base chaplain arrived to offer counseling services to anyone who felt traumatized by witnessing the violent conclusion to what had begun as a routine professional interaction. His presence reflecting military recognition that incidents involving allegations of sexual harassment and physical confrontation could have lasting psychological effects on observers as well as direct participants. Lieutenant Colonel Williams coordinated with the base legal office to ensure that all investigative procedures complied with military regulations governing incidents involving civilian contractors and allegations of inappropriate conduct by senior officers. Her experience with similar cases had taught her that proper handling of initial evidence collection and witness interviews was essential for ensuring that subsequent legal proceedings could be conducted fairly and effectively. The ceremony's remaining events were quietly canceled as attention focused on managing the immediate aftermath of an incident that had transformed a routine military celebration into a formal investigation requiring coordination between military police, legal offices, medical personnel, and public affairs specialists. The logistics of handling multiple competing priorities while maintaining operational security and protecting the rights of all involved parties required careful coordination and clear communication among various base agencies. Sarah's continued cooperation with the investigation impressed military personnel who had expected either defensive behavior or demands for legal representation before
Ransom about her involvement in an incident that could potentially result in criminal charges depending on how authorities chose to characterize her response.
To Colonel Brennan's unwelcome physical contact,
Her professional background became a subject of intense interest as investigators sought to understand how a civilian physical therapist had acquired the specific skills necessary to incapacitate a larger, stronger military officer with such efficiency and precision. Standard physical therapy training included basic anatomy and biomechanics instruction, but the technique she had employed suggested specialized knowledge that went beyond routine civilian education and certification requirements. The Base Intelligence Office was quietly tasked with conducting a more thorough background investigation into Sarah's professional history and personal associations, their inquiry focusing on identifying any previous military or law enforcement connections that might explain her expected capabilities and her calm response to a situation that would have overwhelmed most civilian contractors. Initial database searches revealed educational credentials and professional licensing information that aligned with her stated qualifications, but several gaps in her employment history and the classified nature of some previous contract work raised questions about whether her official biography provided a complete picture of her background and experience. Security clearance records indicated previous work with military special operations units and law enforcement tactical teams, assignments that would have required specialized training in personal protection techniques and crisis response procedures. The classified nature of some projects made detailed verification impossible through normal investigative channels, but the pattern suggested someone whose professional background included elements that weren't reflected in standard civilian contractor documentation. As the afternoon progressed and more information became available about both Sarah's background and Colonel Brennan's medical condition, the initial characterization of the incident began to shift from a criminal assault case toward a justified defensive response to inappropriate conduct by a senior officer whose behavior had created a situation requiring immediate protective action. The base commander was briefed on the developing situation through secure communication channels that ensured operational security while providing senior leadership with the information necessary to make informed decisions about media relations, legal proceedings, and administrative actions that would be required to address the incident's broader implications for base operations and personnel policies. Medical reports from the base hospital confirmed that Colonel Brennan had sustained multiple fractures requiring surgical intervention and extended rehabilitation, injuries that would effectively end his participation in any upcoming assignments and likely impact his ability to continue serving in command positions requiring full physical capability. The severity of his injuries provided clear evidence of the force and precision involved in Sarah's defensive response. The contrast between Sarah's composed professionalism and Colonel Brennan's medical emergency created a narrative that challenged conventional assumptions about power dynamics, personal capability, and the effectiveness of formal authority in situations involving individuals whose skills and experience extended beyond what their official positions might suggest. As evening approached and the immediate crisis management phase of the incident response transitioned toward longer-term investigation and administrative processing, one fact had become increasingly clear to everyone involved: the quiet civilian contractor who had been arranging injury prevention brochures at a routine military ceremony possessed capabilities that extended far beyond anything suggested by her professional credentials or unremarkable appearance. The full scope of Sarah Mitchell's background remained classified information requiring specialized clearances to access, but the demonstration of her abilities had been witnessed by 190 soldiers whose understanding of civilian contractors had been permanently altered by watching someone they had initially dismissed as background personnel incapacitate a senior military officer with clinical precision and professional composure. The incident at Fort Riverside would ultimately become a case study in multiple areas: appropriate conduct towards civilian contractors, the importance of recognizing that expertise comes in many forms, and the reality that some individuals possess capabilities that aren't immediately apparent from their official roles or public personas. For everyone present that afternoon, it served as a reminder that assumptions about others' capabilities often reveal more about the observer's limitations than about the observed person's actual qualifications and experience. The investigation would continue for several weeks as military authorities worked to establish a complete factual record of what had occurred and determine appropriate administrative and legal responses to an incident that had challenged multiple assumptions about authority, capability, and professional conduct in military environments. But for those who had witnessed Sarah Mitchell's response to Colonel Brennan's inappropriate behavior, the lesson was already clear. Respect should be based on character and competence rather than rank and appearance. And underestimating others based on superficial impressions could lead to consequences that were both immediate and unforgettable. The investigation's direction shifted dramatically when Lieutenant Colonel Williams received a secure phone call from the Pentagon that lasted 47 minutes and required her to clear her office of all personnel before taking the conversation. When she emerged from that classified discussion, her demeanor had transformed from careful fact-gathering to something approaching institutional damage control, and her immediate instructions to all personnel involved in the case carried the weight of directives that originated far above the base command structure. Master Sergeant Hayes was summoned to Williams' office within minutes of her completing the Pentagon call. His 28 years of experience allowing him to recognize when routine investigations had evolved into matters requiring the highest levels of discretion and security awareness. The conversation that followed would remain classified, but Hayes emerged with a significantly altered understanding of both the incident itself and the broader implications that extended well beyond Fort Riverside's administrative boundaries. The base intelligence officer, Major Sandra Kim, found herself tasked with conducting a comprehensive review of all security footage from the ceremony grounds, her analysis focusing not on establishing basic facts about the confrontation but rather on identifying any personnel who might have captured detailed images or video of Sarah Mitchell during the incident. The thoroughness of this effort suggested concerns that extended beyond normal public affairs management into areas that involved operational security and personnel protection protocols. Sarah's cooperation with the investigation continued unabated, but the nature of questions being asked had evolved from basic fact-gathering toward more sophisticated inquiries about her background, training, and previous assignments that required careful navigation of classified information boundaries. Her responses demonstrated familiarity with security protocols and information compartmentalization that impressed military interrogators, accustomed to dealing with individuals possessing various levels of clearance and operational experience. The medical evaluation of Colonel Brennan's injuries had revealed details that further complicated the case's trajectory, as orthopedic specialists determined that the specific technique used to incapacitate him required not only extensive training but also precise knowledge of human anatomy and joint mechanics that went far beyond what civilian self-defense courses typically provided. The clinical precision of the attack suggested professional instruction in techniques designed for maximum effectiveness with minimal permanent damage. Captain Rodriguez found herself coordinating with multiple agencies whose involvement in what had initially appeared to be a straightforward assault case indicated complexities that reached into areas of military operations she had never encountered during her legal training. Her case file had grown to include correspondence from organizations whose existence was acknowledged only through acronyms and whose interest in the Fort Riverside incident suggested connections that weren't immediately apparent from surface facts. The base chaplain reported increased requests for confidential counseling from personnel who had witnessed the incident, their concerns focusing not on the violence they had observed but rather on the implications of discovering that someone they had dismissed as a routine contractor possessed capabilities that challenged their understanding of civilian expertise and military security. The psychological impact of witnessing assumptions proven dramatically wrong was requiring more extensive support than anyone had anticipated. Private Johnson's parents received an unexpected visit from military personnel who politely but firmly explained that their son's potential testimony in the ongoing investigation involved matters of national security that required careful handling. and that his cooperation with official inquiries was both appreciated and mandatory regardless of his personal preferences about involvement in what had begun as a routine ceremony assignment. The Fort Riverside Public Affairs Office implemented communication protocols typically reserved for incidents involving classified operations or sensitive personnel. Their press releases containing minimal factual information while emphasizing the base's commitment to thorough investigation and appropriate administrative response. The carefully neutral language masked growing awareness that standard public relations approaches were inadequate for managing an incident whose implications extended into classified operational areas. Sarah's temporary quarters on base had been quietly upgraded to VIP accommodations that included enhanced security measures and restricted access protocols. Changes that were implemented without official explanation but clearly indicated that her status had evolved from routine witness to someone requiring protection and special handling. Her acceptance of these arrangements without question or complaint suggested familiarity with security procedures that went beyond normal civilian contractor experience. The investigation team expanded to include specialists from various military and civilian agencies whose specific areas of expertise remained classified, but whose involvement indicated that standard criminal investigation procedures were insufficient for addressing the complexities that had emerged from what had initially appeared to be a straightforward incident and involving inappropriate conduct and defensive response. Colonel Brennan's medical treatment had been transferred to a specialized facility whose selection appeared to be based on security considerations rather than purely medical factors. His care now involving physicians whose clearances allowed them to treat personnel whose injuries might reveal information about classified capabilities or operational techniques. The move effectively isolated him from routine medical personnel and media access while ensuring that his treatment remained within controlled channels. The ceremony attendees who had served as witnesses found themselves subject to individual interviews that were conducted with a level of detail and security awareness that suggested their observations had implications extending beyond normal legal proceedings. Each witness was required to sign documentation acknowledging their understanding that certain aspects of what they had observed involved matters of national security requiring ongoing discretion and cooperation with official inquiries. Sarah's professional credentials were subjected to verification procedures that went far beyond routine background checks, as investigators sought to understand not only her official qualifications but also the source of skills that had proven dramatically more extensive than her civilian contractor status had suggested. The classified nature of much of her previous work meant that complete verification required coordination with agencies whose involvement indicated the investigation's evolution into areas of operational security and personnel protection. The base commander received briefings that were conducted in secure facilities and involved personnel whose presence at Fort Riverside required special transportation and accommodation arrangements. Their participation indicating that what had begun as a routine disciplinary matter had evolved into something requiring attention from military and civilian officials whose normal responsibilities involved much more sensitive operations than ceremony management. Master Sergeant Hayes found his role in the investigation expanding to include liaison duties with visiting officials whose specific agencies remained unidentified but whose authority to direct investigative procedures was clearly established through channels that bypassed normal base command structure. His cooperation with these officials required him to compartmentalize information in ways that were unfamiliar even to someone with extensive experience handling classified military. The legal aspects of the case had become significantly more complex as military attorneys discovered that standard procedures for handling assault cases were inadequate when the incident involved personnel whose backgrounds required special handling and whose capabilities raised questions about appropriate legal frameworks for evaluation. The intersection of civilian contractor rights, military justice procedures, and classified operations created jurisdictional challenges that required consultation with specialized legal experts. Lieutenant Colonel Williams coordinated with base security to implement enhanced monitoring of all personnel who had been present during the incident. Her instructions emphasizing the importance of identifying any attempts to share information about what had been observed or to contact external media or investigative organizations about the case. The comprehensive nature of these security measures indicated concerns that extended well beyond normal operational security procedures. Sarah's daily routine on base had been structured to minimize her exposure to routine personnel while maintaining her availability for ongoing investigative interviews and procedural requirements. Her accommodation arrangements included meal delivery and transportation that avoided common areas where casual interactions with military personnel might lead to informal discussions about the incident or her background. The forensic analysis of the incident site had been conducted with thoroughness typically reserved for investigations involving potential espionage or terrorist activities, as specialists sought to recover any physical evidence that might provide additional insight into the techniques used or the level of training required to execute them with such precision. The detailed documentation of every aspect of the confrontation suggested that the case had implications extending far beyond routine criminal proceedings. Colonel Brennan's recovery process was being managed through medical channels that emphasized security and discretion. His treatment plan including specialized rehabilitation designed to address not only his physical injuries but also any psychological impact from discovering that his assumptions about civilian contractors had been so dramatically incorrect. The comprehensive nature of his care indicated recognition that his experience had implications extending beyond personal recovery. The intelligence community's interest in the case had become apparent through the involvement of analysts whose presence at Fort Riverside required special clearances, and whose questions about Sarah's background demonstrated access to information that wasn't available through normal investigative channels. Their participation indicated that what had occurred during the ceremony had relevance to ongoing operations and security considerations that extended beyond base-level concerns. Captain Rodriguez worked with legal specialists whose expertise involved intersection of civilian contractor rights, military justice, and classified operations law. Their consultation indicating that standard legal frameworks were insufficient for addressing a case that involved personnel whose capabilities and backgrounds required special consideration. The complexity of legal issues involved had grown to require coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The Base Psychological Services Office implemented protocols for monitoring and supporting personnel who had been affected by witnessing an incident that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian contractors and military authority. The counseling approaches developed specifically for this case indicated recognition that the psychological impact of discovering hidden expertise could be more significant than the impact of witnessing violence itself. Sarah's interactions with investigative personnel demonstrated familiarity with procedures and protocols that suggested extensive previous experience with security investigations and classified operations debriefings. Her comfort with complex interview procedures and information compartmentalization impressed officials accustomed to dealing with military and intelligence personnel rather than civilian contractors. The media attention that had initially threatened to complicate the case was managed through information control procedures that effectively limited external access to details about what had occurred while maintaining the appearance of transparency and cooperation with legitimate press inquiries. The sophisticated nature of these information management techniques indicated resources and expertise that extended beyond routine base public affairs capabilities. As the investigation progressed through its second week, the focus had shifted entirely from determining whether Sarah's actions were legally justified toward understanding the broader implications of an incident that had revealed capability and connections that raised questions about personnel security, operational effectiveness, and the adequacy of existing procedures for managing civilian contractors whose backgrounds involved classified operations. The case had evolved into a comprehensive review of policies and procedures that govern civilian contractor integration into military operations, particularly regarding personnel whose previous experience involved classified activities that might not be reflected in standard background documentation. The lessons learned from the Fort Riverside incident would ultimately influence contractor management practices across multiple military installations and operational commands. For Sarah Mitchell, the investigation represented both vindication of her defensive actions and recognition that her attempt to maintain a low-profile civilian career had been permanently complicated by circumstances that had forced revelation of capabilities she had hoped to keep private. Her cooperation with the ongoing inquiry reflected understanding that her future opportunities would depend on how effectively officials could balance operational security requirements with her legitimate desires for privacy and normal professional development. The transformation of a routine ceremony incident into a classified investigation involving multiple agencies and specialized personnel had demonstrated the complex challenges involved in managing personnel whose expertise extended beyond their official role, and whose presence in routine civilian positions might have implications that weren't immediately apparent to standard. The Fort Riverside incident would ultimately become a case study in personnel management security procedures, and the importance of recognizing that expertise and capability could exist in forms that weren't immediately apparent through routine observation or standard documentation. For everyone involved, it served as a reminder that assumptions about others' capabilities often revealed more about institutional
limitations than about individual qualifications and experience. 3 months after the incident that would forever change how Fort Riverside approached civilian contractor relations, the final investigative report was classified at levels that required special congressional notification, its conclusions and recommendations distributed only to personnel whose clearances and operational responsibilities required access to its sensitive findings. The document itself would become a template for handling similar cases across the military, though few would ever know of its existence or understand the precedents it had established. Sarah Mitchell's true identity had been revealed through the investigation as Dr. Sarah Chen, a former Defense Intelligence Agency operative, whose official death in Afghanistan 7 years earlier had been carefully orchestrated to provide cover for her transition into civilian life. After completing assignments that remained classified at the highest levels, her expertise in close-quarters combat, intelligence gathering, and security operations had been earned through missions that had never officially occurred in countries where American military presence was publicly denied. The physical therapy credentials that had brought her to Fort Riverside were legitimate, earned during her transition period as part of a comprehensive program designed to provide former deep cover operatives with civilian careers that utilized their skills while maintaining their security and anonymity. Her selection of rehabilitation medicine had been both practical and strategic, offering opportunities to work with military and law enforcement personnel, while maintaining the kind of low-profile existence that ensured her continued safety and operational security. Colonel Brennan's recovery had been complicated by more than just the physical trauma to his hand and wrist, as the psychological impact of discovering that his assumptions about civilian contractors had been so catastrophically wrong had required extensive counseling and re-evaluation of his fitness for continued command responsibilities. His medical retirement was processed through accelerated channels that emphasized his distinguished service record while quietly acknowledging that his judgment and decision-making capabilities had been compromised by the incident. The administrative consequences for Brennan extended beyond medical retirement, as the investigation had uncovered a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward civilian contractors and subordinate personnel that had been overlooked or inadequately addressed throughout his career. His case became a catalyst for comprehensive review of complaint procedures and accountability mechanisms that had previously allowed senior officers to escape consequences for behavior that violated both military regulations and basic standards of professional conduct. Lieutenant Colonel Williams assumed responsibility for implementing new protocols that emerged from the Fort Riverside investigation,
her role expanding to include oversight of contractor relations and security procedures that reflected lessons learned about the complexity of managing personnel, whose backgrounds might include classified capabilities, not reflected in standard documentation. Her position became a model for similar assignments at installations across the military, as senior leadership recognized the need for specialized expertise in managing civilian contractor integration. The 190 soldiers who had witnessed Sarah's demonstration of unexpected capabilities found themselves subject to ongoing security monitoring and periodic interviews designed to ensure that their understanding of what they had observed remained appropriately compartmentalized. Many reported that the incident had fundamentally altered their approach to interacting with civilian contractors, leading to increased respect and professional courtesy that reflected recognition that expertise could exist in forms that weren't immediately apparent. Master Sergeant Hayes received commendation for his professional handling of a complex situation that had required navigation of security protocols and investigative procedures extending far beyond normal base-level incidents. His experience with the case led to his selection for specialized training in contractor security management, preparing him to serve as a resource for similar incidents that might occur as military operations increasingly relied on civilian expertise and support. Captain Rodriguez was assigned to the Military Legal Office's new Civilian Contractor Liaison Division, her experience with the Fort Riverside case providing valuable insight into the legal complexities that emerged when standard military justice procedures intersected with classified operations and personnel protection requirements. Her work would contribute to development of legal frameworks that better address the unique challenges posed by incidents involving personnel whose backgrounds required special consideration. Private Johnson completed his military service with a security clearance upgrade that reflected his involvement in a classified investigation, though the specific details of what he had witnessed remained compartmentalized information that he was required to protect throughout his subsequent civilian career. His experience at Fort Riverside became a defining moment that influenced his approach to civilian-military relations and his understanding of the complexity of modern military operations. The Base Intelligence Office implemented new procedures for background verification of civilian contractors that reflected recognition that standard clearance investigations might not reveal all relevant information about personnel whose previous assignments had involved deep cover operations or other classified activities requiring extraordinary security measures. These enhanced procedures became standard across military installations, fundamentally changing how contractor security was managed and evaluated. Sarah's transition back to civilian life was managed through programs specifically designed for personnel whose cover identities had been compromised through circumstances beyond their control. Her relocation and new identity establishment handled through channels that ensured her continued security while acknowledging that her previous attempts at anonymity had been permanently disrupted. Her new assignment involved consultation work with military and intelligence agencies on contractor security and personnel protection issues. The ceremony that had been interrupted by Colonel Brennan's inappropriate behavior was rescheduled and completed with enhanced security protocols and contractor protection measures that reflected institutional learning from the incident. The event became a model for military ceremonies involving civilian contractors, demonstrating how proper planning and security awareness could prevent similar incidents while maintaining the professional atmosphere appropriate for formal military functions. Fort Riverside's contractor relations program was completely restructured based on recommendations from the investigation, with new training requirements for military personnel that emphasized respect, professionalism, and recognition that civilian contractors might possess expertise and capabilities that weren't immediately apparent from their official roles or documentation. The program became a template that was adopted by military installations worldwide. The medical rehabilitation techniques that Sarah had developed during her physical therapy training were incorporated into programs for treating military personnel recovering from combat injuries, her expertise providing valuable contributions to improved care for wounded warriors while maintaining the security protocols that protected her identity and operational background. Her work in this area became a lasting positive legacy of her forced emergence from anonymity. Colonel Brennan's case became a catalyst for comprehensive review of senior officer conduct policies and accountability mechanisms, leading to implementation of new reporting procedures and investigation protocols designed to ensure that complaints about inappropriate behavior received proper attention regardless of the accused person's rank or service record. These reforms addressed systemic problems that had allowed misconduct to continue unchallenged for too long. The intelligence community's analysis of the Fort Riverside incident contributed to broader discussions about the challenges of integrating personnel with classified backgrounds into civilian roles, particularly regarding the balance between operational security requirements and the legitimate career development needs of former operatives seeking to transition into normal civilian life. These discussions influenced policy development for managing similar transitions in the future. The psychological support services that were developed for personnel affected by the incident became a model for addressing the unique counseling needs that emerged when military personnel discovered that their assumptions about civilian contractors had been dramatically incorrect. The recognition that witnessing hidden expertise could be psychologically challenging led to improved support services for similar situations. Sarah's expertise in identifying and addressing security vulnerabilities was quietly utilized by multiple military installations seeking to improve their contractor management and security procedures. Her insights providing valuable contributions to enhanced protection for both military personnel and civilian contractors working in potentially sensitive environments. Her consulting work helped prevent similar incidents while maintaining the security protocols that protected her identity. The legal precedents established through the Fort Riverside case influenced how military justice procedures addressed incidents involving civilian contractors whose backgrounds included classified operations, creating frameworks that balanced protection of operational security with fair treatment of all parties involved in complex investigations. These precedents became important resources for military legal officers handling similar cases. The public affairs management of the Fort Riverside incident became a case study in effective information control that protected operational security while maintaining transparency appropriate for legitimate public interest in military operations and personnel policies. The techniques developed for managing media attention to classified investigations became standard procedures for similar situations. The base security protocols that were implemented following the investigation reflected recognition that traditional approaches to contractor screening and monitoring were inadequate for identifying personnel whose capabilities and backgrounds required special consideration. These enhanced protocols became standard practice across military installations, fundamentally improving security and personnel management. Fort Riverside's transformation from a routine training facility into a model installation for contractor relations and security management reflected the comprehensive institutional learning that had emerged from a single incident that had challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian expertise and military authority. The changes implemented there influenced military operations worldwide. The medical care provided to Colonel Brennan during his recovery included specialized treatment for the psychological trauma of discovering that his worldview and assumptions about power dynamics had been so completely wrong. His case contributing to improved understanding of how senior military personnel could be affected by incidents that challenged their fundamental beliefs about authority and capability. Sarah's continued work in physical therapy and security consultation allowed her to contribute positively to military and law enforcement operations while maintaining the kind of professional satisfaction that had motivated her original transition from intelligence operations to civilian life. Her career became a model for successful integration of former operatives into roles that utilized their expertise while protecting their security. The training programs that emerged from the Fort Riverside investigation emphasized the importance of recognizing that expertise existed in many forms and that professional competence should be evaluated based on performance and results rather than assumptions about background or appearance. These programs became integral parts of military education at all levels. The institutional memory of the Fort Riverside incident became part of the unofficial education that senior military personnel received about the complexity of modern military operations and the importance of treating all personnel with respect and professionalism regardless of their apparent status or role. The story was shared through informal channels as a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions about others' capabilities. Years later, when military personnel at Fort Riverside encountered civilian contractors, they approached these interactions with a level of respect and professional courtesy that reflected institutional learning from an incident that had demonstrated the potentially serious consequences of inappropriate behavior and unfounded assumptions. The cultural change that had emerged from Sarah's defensive response to Colonel Brennan's misconduct became a permanent improvement in how the installation approached civilian-military relations. The Fort Riverside incident ultimately became a defining moment that influenced military policies, procedures and culture regarding civilian contractor relations, personnel security, and the recognition that expertise and capability could exist in forms that weren't immediately apparent through routine observation or standard documentation. For everyone involved, it served as a powerful reminder that respect should be based on character and competence rather than rank and appearance, and that underestimating others based on superficial impressions could lead to consequences that were both immediate and unforgettable. The legacy of that spring afternoon, when a quiet physical therapist had demonstrated capabilities that challenged every assumption about civilian continued to influence military operations and personnel policies long after the immediate participants had moved on to other assignments and responsibilities. The lesson learned at Fort Riverside became part of the institutional wisdom that guided military interactions with civilian personnel, ensuring that the respect and professionalism demonstrated there became the standard rather than the exception. The morning sun cast long shadows across the newly renovated contractor facilities at Fort Riverside, where Sarah Mitchell walked through spaces that had been redesigned based on lessons learned from an incident that had fundamentally altered how military installations approached civilian personnel integration. The enhanced security measures, improved meeting areas, and clearly posted protocols for professional conduct represented institutional acknowledgement that previous approaches had been inadequate for protecting both military personnel and civilian contractors from situations that could escalate beyond appropriate professional boundaries. 5 years had passed since the ceremony that had ended with Colonel Brennan receiving emergency medical treatment and Sarah's quiet existence as an anonymous contractor being permanently disrupted by circumstances that had forced revelation of capabilities she had hoped to keep private. The investigation that followed had consumed months of institutional attention and resources, ultimately producing classified recommendations that had influenced military policies worldwide, while establishing precedents for handling personnel whose backgrounds involved operations that remained officially unacknowledged. Sarah's current role as senior security consultant for defense contractor relations represented both vindication of her professional competence and recognition that her unique combination of operational experience and civilian credentials provided valuable insight into challenges that traditional military and civilian personnel often fail to understand completely. Her position allowed her to contribute meaningfully to improved policies while maintaining the kind of professional satisfaction that had originally motivated her transition from intelligence operations to civilian life. The contractor orientation program that she had developed for Fort Riverside had become a model that was implemented across military installations, its emphasis on mutual respect, clear communication, and professional boundary maintenance reflecting institutional learning from incidents that had demonstrated the serious consequences of inadequate preparation and inappropriate behavior. The program's success was measured not only by reduced complaint rates but also by improved mission effectiveness that resulted from better civilian-military cooperation. Colonel Brennan's medical retirement had been processed with full honors that acknowledged his distinguished service record, while quietly recognizing that his career had been ended by an incident that reflected personal judgment failures rather than any deficiency in his professional competence or military dedication. His case had become a catalyst for comprehensive review of senior officer accountability mechanisms and professional conduct training that had produced lasting improvements in military leadership development and evaluation processes. The physical therapy clinic that operated from Sarah's civilian practice had developed specialized programs for treating military personnel recovering from combat injuries. Her expertise in trauma rehabilitation and understanding of military culture providing unique value that was recognized by both medical professionals and the service members who benefited from her care. Her work in this area had created positive relationships with military medical personnel who appreciated her contributions while respecting the boundaries that protected her privacy and security. Lieutenant Colonel Williams had been promoted to full colonel and assigned to lead the newly created Defense Contractor Integration Office at the Pentagon. Her experience with the Fort Riverside investigation providing valuable insight into policy development that addressed the complex challenges of managing civilian personnel, whose backgrounds might include classified capabilities not reflected in standard documentation. Her position had become instrumental in developing improved procedures for contractor security clearance and background verification processes. The 190 soldiers who had witnessed Sarah's unexpected demonstration of defensive capabilities had completed their military service with enhanced understanding of civilian expertise and professional conduct that influenced their subsequent careers in both military and civilian contexts. Many reported that the incident had fundamentally improved their approach to working with civilian contractors and had contributed to more effective team relationships throughout their professional development. Master Sergeant Hayes had transitioned to civilian employment as a senior consultant for military contractor relations. His extensive experience with security investigations and personnel management providing valuable expertise to companies seeking to improve their relationships with military clients. His work contributed to development of industry standards that reflected lessons learned from incidents like Fort Riverside while maintaining the security protocols that protected sensitive operations and personnel. Captain Rodriguez had completed advanced legal education specializing in military-civilian legal interface issues. Her expertise becoming essential for addressing the increasingly complex legal challenges that emerged as military operations relied more heavily on civilian contractor support. Her work had contributed to development of legal frameworks that better protected the rights of all parties while maintaining operational security requirements essential for national defense missions. The Base Intelligence Office had implemented comprehensive contractor screening procedures that reflected recognition that standard background investigations might not reveal all relevant information about personnel whose previous assignments had involved deep cover operations or other classified activities requiring extraordinary security measures. These procedures had become standard across military installations, fundamentally improving personnel security without creating unnecessary barriers to legitimate contractor employment. Private Johnson had completed college education supported by veterans benefits and was working as a federal investigator specializing in personnel security cases. His experience with the Fort Riverside incident providing valuable insight into the complexities that could emerge when standard procedures involving personnel whose backgrounds required special consideration. His career had been significantly influenced by witnessing an event that had challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian capabilities and military authority. The medical rehabilitation programs that had been developed based on Sarah's expertise were being utilized at military medical facilities worldwide. Her contributions to improved treatment protocols providing lasting benefits to wounded service members while demonstrating how former intelligence operatives could transition successfully into civilian roles that utilized their skills productively. Her work had influenced military medicine in ways that would continue benefiting personnel for decades. Fort Riverside's transformation into a model installation for civilian contractor relations had attracted attention from military leadership seeking to understand how institutional culture could be changed to prevent inappropriate behavior while maintaining operational effectiveness. The comprehensive approach that had been implemented there demonstrated that improved personnel policies could enhance mission accomplishment while creating safer and more professional working environments for all. The psychological counseling services that had been developed for personnel affected by the original incident had evolved into comprehensive support programs that addressed the unique challenges faced by military personnel who discovered that their assumptions about civilian contractors had been dramatically incorrect. These programs had helped numerous service members process experiences that challenged their worldview while providing tools for developing more effective working relationships with civilian personnel. Sarah's consulting work with intelligence agencies had contributed to improved transition programs for former operatives seeking to establish civilian careers. Her experience demonstrating both the challenges and opportunities that existed for personnel whose backgrounds included classified operations that couldn't be acknowledged publicly. Her insights had influenced policy development that better supported successful transitions while maintaining essential security protocol. The legal precedents that had been established through the Fort Riverside case continued to influence how military justice procedures addressed incidents involving civilian contractors, creating frameworks that balanced protection of operational security with fair treatment of all parties involved in complex investigations. These precedents had become important resources for military legal officers handling similar cases across different installations and commands. The contractor facilities that had been redesigned following the investigation featured enhanced security measures and improved workspace configurations that reflected institutional recognition that civilian contractors deserved safe and professional working environments that protected them from inappropriate behavior while facilitating effective collaboration with military personnel. These improvements had become standard features that were implemented at military installations worldwide. The training programs that emerged from institutional learning at Fort Riverside had become integral components of military education at all levels. Their emphasis on recognizing civilian expertise and maintaining professional conduct contributing to improved mission effectiveness and reduced incident rates. The programs had demonstrated that investment in personnel education and culture development produced measurable improvements in operational capability and institutional reputation. The media attention that had initially threatened to complicate the Fort Riverside case had been successfully managed through information control procedures that protected operational security while maintaining appropriate transparency. The techniques developed for handling such situations becoming standard procedures for managing public interest in incidents involving classified personnel or operations. These approaches had proven effective for protecting essential information while maintaining public confidence in military institutions. The institutional memory of the Fort Riverside incident had become part of the unofficial education that military personnel received about the importance of professional conduct and respect for civilian expertise. The story serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of inappropriate behavior and unfounded assumptions. This cultural transmission had contributed to lasting improvements in civilian-military relations across the defense establishment. Sarah's continued presence in the military contractor community served as a reminder that expertise existed in many forms and that professional competence should be evaluated based on performance and results rather than assumptions about background or appearance. Her career had become a model for successful integration of former intelligence operatives into civilian roles that utilized their capabilities while maintaining essential security protocol. The research that had been conducted on the psychological and organizational impacts of the Fort Riverside incident had contributed to academic understanding of how institutions could respond effectively to events that challenged fundamental assumptions about authority and capability. This research had influenced organizational development practices in both military and civilian contexts, demonstrating how crisis situations could be transformed into opportunities for positive change. The security protocols that had been implemented at Fort Riverside following the investigation had proven effective for preventing similar incidents while maintaining the kind of professional atmosphere necessary for effective military operations. These protocols had been adapted for use at installations worldwide, creating standardized approaches that protected personnel while facilitating mission accomplishment. The Contractor Relations Office that Sarah had helped establish at Fort Riverside had become the model that was replicated at military installations globally. Its comprehensive approach to civilian personnel integration demonstrating how institutional investment in improved
and procedures could produce lasting benefits for operational effectiveness and personnel safety. The office had handled hundreds of cases without experiencing any incidents comparable to the original confrontation. Years later, when new military personnel arrived at Fort Riverside and encountered civilian contractors, they were briefed on professional conduct standards that reflected institutional learning from an incident that had demonstrated the serious consequences of inappropriate behavior toward civilian personnel. The briefing emphasized respect, professionalism, and recognition that civilian contractors brought valuable expertise that contributed significantly to mission accomplishment. The comprehensive review of senior officer conduct policies that had been initiated following Colonel Brennan's case had produced lasting reforms in accountability mechanisms and professional development programs that better prepared military leaders for the complex challenges of modern operations involving extensive civilian contractor support. These reforms had contributed to improved leadership quality and reduced rates of misconduct across the military establishment. The Fort Riverside incident had ultimately demonstrated that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond immediate participants, influencing institutional policies and cultural attitudes in ways that produced lasting benefits for military operations and personnel relations. The lessons learned from that spring afternoon continued to influence military practices years later, ensuring that the respect and professionalism that should characterize civilian-military interactions became the standard rather than the exception. The legacy of Sarah Mitchell's defensive response to Colonel Brennan's inappropriate behavior had evolved into institutional wisdom that guided military personnel in their interactions with civilian contractors, creating cultural expectations that prevented similar incidents while facilitating the kind of professional collaboration essential for effective modern military operations. Her quiet competence had ultimately contributed to systemic improvements that would benefit military and civilian personnel for generations. The transformation that had begun with a single incident at a routine ceremony had produced comprehensive changes in military policies, procedures, and culture that demonstrated how individual courage and institutional learning could combine to create lasting positive change. The Fort Riverside model had become a template for military installations worldwide, proving that respectful professional conduct and recognition of civilian expertise were essential components of effective defense operations. The auditorium at the National Defense University was packed with senior military officers, defense contractors, and policy analysts who had gathered to attend the annual symposium on civilian-military integration, an event that had grown significantly in importance since incidents at various installations had demonstrated the need for improved understanding of contractor relations and personnel security. Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, her presentation slides displaying statistical data that reflected comprehensive analysis of contractor incidents across military installations worldwide. Her role as keynote speaker representing recognition of expertise that had been earned through both academic study and practical experience that few in attendance fully understood. Her presentation focused on institutional transformation and cultural change management, drawing from case studies that included Fort Riverside among dozens of installations that had implemented improved contractor relations programs based on lessons learned from incidents that had challenged traditional assumptions about civilian capabilities and military authority. The audience listened with the kind of focused attention that reflected recognition that her insights could influence policies affecting hundreds of thousands of military and civilian personnel across the defense establishment. The research data she presented demonstrated measurable improvements in mission effectiveness, personnel satisfaction, and incident reduction at installations that had adopted comprehensive contractor integration programs.
her analysis providing compelling evidence that investment in improved policies and training produced tangible benefits for operational capability and institutional reputation. Her academic credentials and practical experience had established her as a leading expert in a field that had emerged from recognition that traditional approaches were inadequate for managing increasingly complex civilian-military relationships. Among the audience members was General Patricia Morrison, who had recently assumed responsibility for defense personnel and readiness policy development. Her attention focused on Sarah's recommendations for scaling successful contractor integration programs across all military services. The general's presence at the symposium reflected senior leadership recognition that civilian contractor relations had become a strategic priority, requiring comprehensive policy attention and resource allocation. Dr. Marcus Thompson, who served as director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, was taking detailed notes on Sarah's analysis of security clearance and background verification procedures. His agency responsible for implementing enhanced screening protocols that had been developed based on lessons learned from incidents involving personnel whose backgrounds included classified operations not reflected in standard documentation. His interest in her recommendations reflected awareness that current procedures required continuous improvement to address evolving security challenges. The presentation included case studies from military installations that had experienced significant improvements in contractor relations following implementation of comprehensive training programs, professional conduct policies, and facility modifications designed to create safer and more productive working environments for civilian personnel. These examples demonstrated that institutional change was both possible and beneficial when supported by adequate resources and sustained leadership commitment. Sarah's discussion of psychological factors that influence civilian-military interactions drew from research that had been conducted following various incidents where military personnel had discovered that their assumptions about civilian contractors had been dramatically incorrect. Her analysis emphasized the importance of addressing cognitive biases and cultural assumptions that could lead to inappropriate behavior and missed opportunities for effective collaboration. The policy recommendations that concluded her presentation reflected comprehensive understanding of the complex challenges involved in managing civilian personnel, whose expertise and capabilities might extend beyond their official roles or documented qualifications. Her suggestions for improved screening procedures, enhanced training programs, and comprehensive accountability mechanisms represented distillation of lessons learned from multiple incidents that had demonstrated the serious consequences of inadequate institutional preparation. Following her presentation, Sarah participated in a panel discussion that included former military commanders who had implemented successful contractor integration programs at their installations, their experiences providing practical perspectives on the challenges and benefits associated with comprehensive policy reform. The discussion emphasized that institutional change required sustained commitment from senior leadership and adequate resources for training, facility improvement, and program implementation. The questions from audience members reflected genuine interest in understanding how the principles she had outlined could be adapted for different operational environments and mission requirements. Their inquiries demonstrating recognition that civilian contractor integration had become an essential capability for modern military operations. Her responses drew from extensive consulting experience that had provided insight into diverse institutional challenges and successful adaptation strategies. During the networking reception that followed the formal presentations, Sarah found herself surrounded by military officers and defense contractors seeking to understand how her recommended approaches could be implemented within their organizations. Their interest reflecting awareness that contractor relations had evolved from administrative support function to strategic operational capability requiring specialized expertise and sustained attention. Colonel James Rivera, who had recently assumed command of a major training installation, described challenges his facility was experiencing with contractor integration and sought specific advice about training program development and facility modification priorities. His questions reflected the kind of practical leadership concerns that had motivated military commanders to seek improved approaches for managing civilian personnel effectively while maintaining operational security and mission focus. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, representing a major defense contracting firm, inquired about industry best practices for preparing civilian personnel to work effectively within military environments. Her questions reflecting contractor recognition that successful military relationships required understanding of institutional culture and professional conduct expectations that extended beyond technical competence and security clearance requirements. The conversations continued throughout the evening as participants recognized opportunities to share experiences and develop collaborative approaches for addressing challenges that affected both military and civilian organizations involved in defense operations. The symposium had created networking opportunities that would lead to ongoing professional relationships and information sharing that would benefit contractor integration efforts across the defense establishment. Sarah's hotel room that evening was quiet refuge from the intensity of professional networking and public speaking that had characterized the symposium. Her reflection on the day's events, including recognition that her transition from anonymous contractor to recognized expert had been completed through circumstances that she had neither sought nor anticipated. Her current role represented fulfillment of professional aspirations while acknowledging that her path to expertise had been shaped by experiences that remained largely classified and unacknowledged. The morning brought additional speaking engagements at military educational institutions where her expertise in contractor relations and security procedures was increasingly sought by faculty developing curricula for officer and enlisted professional development programs. Her teaching responsibilities reflected institutional recognition that civilian-military integration had become an essential competency requiring formal education and training rather than relying on experience-based learning that could produce inconsistent results. Her consultation work with individual military installations continued to provide practical opportunities to implement improved policies and procedures while maintaining the kind of hands-on involvement that ensured her recommendations remained grounded in operational reality rather than theoretical abstractions. Each consulting engagement provided additional case study material that informed her research and contributed to continuous refinement of best practices for contractor integration. The research laboratory that she had established at Georgetown University was conducting longitudinal studies of personnel attitudes and behavior changes at installations that had implemented comprehensive contractor integration programs. Her academic work providing empirical foundation for policy recommendations that influenced defense personnel management across military services. Her research was funded through grants that acknowledged the strategic importance of understanding civilian-military relations for national security effectiveness. The advisory committee appointments that had followed her emergence as a recognized expert included membership on panels that reviewed defense contractor policies for multiple government agencies. Her expertise contributing to development of improved procedures for managing civilian personnel whose backgrounds might include capabilities and experience not reflected in standard documentation. These appointments represented institutional trust that had been earned through demonstrated competence and professional integrity. Sarah's personal life had adapted to the visibility and professional demands that accompanied her expert status, though she maintained privacy regarding aspects of her background that remained classified and unacknowledgeable through public channels. Her relationships reflected understanding that her professional responsibilities included obligations to protect information and personnel whose security depended on discretion that extended beyond normal civilian privacy expectations. The military installations where she continued to provide consultation services had developed reputations as model facilities for contractor relations, their success stories becoming examples that influenced policy development and resource allocation decisions affecting similar programs across the defense establishment. The measurable improvements in mission effectiveness and personnel satisfaction at these installations provided compelling evidence for continued investment in comprehensive contractor integration programs. The academic conferences where she presented research findings had become important forums for sharing information and developing collaborative approaches for addressing challenges that affected military and civilian organizations involved in defense operations. Her presentations consistently attracted audiences that included senior military leaders, defense contractors, and policy analysts seeking practical insights for improving institutional effectiveness. The mentorship relationships that she had developed with younger professionals entering the contractor relations field reflected commitment to sharing knowledge and experience that would contribute to continued improvement in civilian-military integration capabilities. Her guidance helped emerging experts avoid common mistakes while developing skills necessary for success in complex institutional environments that required understanding of both military culture and civilian professional expectations. The publication of her comprehensive handbook on defense contractor integration had established definitive reference material that was adopted by military educational institutions and used by installations implementing improved contractor relations programs. The handbook's practical guidance and theoretical framework reflected synthesis of extensive research, consultation experience, and lessons learned from incidents that had demonstrated both challenges and opportunities for institutional improvement. Years later, when military personnel encountered civilian contractors at installations worldwide, their interactions were guided by training and policies that reflected principles that Sarah had helped establish through research, consultation, and advocacy that had transformed contractor relations from administrative afterthought to strategic capability essential for effective military operations. Her contributions had produced lasting improvements that would benefit defense operations for generations. The Fort Riverside incident that had initiated Sarah's transition from anonymous contractor to recognized expert had become a case study that was used in military education programs to illustrate the importance of professional conduct, respect for civilian expertise, and recognition that capabilities existed in forms that weren't immediately apparent through routine observation or standard documentation. The lessons learned from that spring afternoon continued to influence military culture and policy development years after the immediate participants had moved on to other responsibilities. The institutional transformation that had begun with a single defensive action had evolved into comprehensive changes in military policies, procedures, and culture that demonstrated how individual courage and institutional learning could combine to create lasting positive change. The impact of Sarah's response to inappropriate behavior had extended far beyond immediate personal consequences to influence systemic improvements that enhanced the effectiveness and professionalism of defense operations worldwide. Her legacy reflected demonstration that expertise and capability deserved respect regardless of their source or apparent packaging, and that institutional success required recognition that civilian contractors brought valuable contributions that enhanced rather than competed with military effectiveness. The cultural changes that had emerged from her experience had created environments where professional competence was evaluated based on performance rather than assumptions about background or appearance. The comprehensive approach to contractor integration that had been developed based on lessons learned from Fort Riverside and similar incidents had become standard practice across military installations, its emphasis on mutual respect, clear communication, and professional boundary maintenance creating frameworks that prevented inappropriate behavior while facilitating effective collaboration essential for mission accomplishment in increasingly complex operational environments. The memorial ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery drew hundreds of attendees who had gathered to honor Colonel Marcus Brennan's passing. His funeral, conducted with full military honors that acknowledged decades of distinguished service while quietly recognizing that his career had been complicated by an incident that had fundamentally altered his understanding of authority and personal judgment. Sarah Mitchell stood among the civilian mourners, her presence reflecting respect for a man whose final years had been marked by genuine attempts at personal redemption following the confrontation that had ended his active military service. The transformation that had occurred in Brennan's character during his medical retirement had surprised many who had known him during his command years, as he had devoted considerable energy to supporting programs that protected civilian contractors from inappropriate behavior and harassment. His advocacy work had included testimony before congressional committees reviewing military personnel policies, his candid acknowledgement of his own failures providing powerful evidence for the need for comprehensive reform in military culture and accountability mechanisms. Sarah had maintained periodic contact with Brennan during his retirement, their relationship evolving from adversarial confrontation to mutual understanding based on shared commitment to preventing similar incidents from affecting other military and civilian personnel. His genuine remorse and sustained efforts to address systemic problems had earned her grudging respect, though she never forgot the circumstances that had initially brought them together under such difficult conditions. The memorial service included tributes from military officers whose careers had benefited from reforms that Brennan had championed during his final years. Their speeches acknowledging that his advocacy for improved contractor relations had contributed significantly to cultural changes that had enhanced military effectiveness while creating safer working environments for civilian personnel. His legacy reflected complex recognition that personal failure could motivate meaningful institutional improvement when channeled through genuine commitment to positive change. Following the ceremony, Sarah joined other mourners at the reception, where conversations naturally turned to memories of Brennan's later work and the lasting impact of policies he had helped develop during his retirement advocacy efforts. The gathering included military officers, defense contractors, and policy experts whose careers had been influenced by reforms that had emerged from lessons learned through his personal experience with the consequences of inappropriate conduct. The conversations at the reception reflected broader recognition that Brennan's case had become a catalyst for comprehensive examination of military culture and leadership accountability that had produced measurable improvements in personnel policies and training programs across all military services. His willingness to acknowledge mistakes and work for systemic reform had transformed what could have been a cautionary tale about abuse of authority into a model for how individuals could contribute to positive institutional change. The drive home from Arlington provided Sarah with quiet time to reflect on the complex legacy of an incident that had begun with inappropriate behavior and defensive response, but had ultimately contributed to improvements that had benefited thousands of military and civilian personnel. The transformation that had occurred in both her own career and Brennan's final years demonstrated that difficult experiences could produce positive outcomes when approached with commitment to learning and improvement rather than defensiveness and denial. Her current position as director of the newly established Institute for Defense Contractor Relations represented culmination of professional development that had been initiated by circumstances she had neither sought nor anticipated. The Institute's mission included research, training, and policy development that would continue advancing improved civilian-military integration long after current personnel had moved on to other responsibilities, ensuring that lessons learned from various incidents would produce lasting benefits for defense operations. The evening news included a brief segment about Brennan's funeral that mentioned his advocacy work during retirement without referencing the specific incident that had motivated his involvement in contractor relations reform. The discretion that had been maintained regarding details of the Fort Riverside confrontation reflected ongoing security considerations while allowing recognition of positive contributions that had emerged from that difficult experience. The secure phone call that Sarah received later that evening came from a former colleague whose continued involvement in classified operations required periodic coordination regarding information that remained sensitive despite the passage of time. Their conversation included updates on personnel whose careers had been influenced by policies that had emerged from the Fort Riverside case, confirmation that institutional changes were producing the intended improvements in contractor security and personnel protection. The memorial scholarship that had been established in Brennan's honor would provide educational support for military personnel pursuing advanced degrees in leadership development and personnel management. His family's decision to focus the scholarship on these areas reflecting understanding that his most meaningful legacy involved contributions to improved military. The scholarship criteria included emphasis on ethical leadership and respect for civilian expertise that reflected lessons learned from his personal experience. Sarah's own legacy continued evolving through research, consultation, and education that influenced defense policies worldwide, her expertise providing guidance for military and civilian organizations seeking to improve contractor integration and personnel relations. The incident that had initiated her transition from anonymous contractor to recognized expert had ultimately produced systemic improvements that would benefit defense operations for decades beyond her active involvement. The comprehensive approach to civilian-military relations that had been developed based on lessons learned from Fort Riverside and similar incidents had become standard practice that influenced military operations globally, demonstrating that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond immediate participants to create lasting positive change for entire institutions and the personnel they served. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.